for showing up on a rainy night with possible tornado warnings. I also want to thank the library very much for sponsoring this, Paige Hurst for putting this all together. They say the key to a good speech is to have a good beginning, a good ending, and to keep them as close together as possible. And tonight I promise you 2 out of 3. And to get started, I want to show you what I think is my good beginning. This is a public service announcement from the British equivalent of our Food and Drug Administration.
Certain foods are high in saturated fat. This is the average amount of saturated fat a person consumes in a month. If you eat too much of this, then over time fatty deposits could build up in your arteries, and this increases your risk of heart disease. If saturated fat can clog this pipe, imagine what it's doing to yours. For ways to cut down, visit the Eat Well website. If you want the facts on food, learn the standard.
Well, I don't know about you. I learned some interesting scientific facts from that announcement. I learned, for instance, that saturated fat is a liquid in a cold refrigerator, then becomes solid in a room temperature pipe. This, of course, explains why when you want to make ice, you pull the water out of your freezer and put it on the counter until the cubes are formed. I also learned I should never inject saturated fat directly into my coronary arteries, especially if they're at room temperature. Most importantly, I learned any food that clogs your drain pipe will also clog your coronary arteries. This, of course, made me very anxious to figure out what other foods will clog my coronary arteries. So I hired a couple of research assistants, and we conducted a series of experiments. We soon realized that bread will clog your coronary arteries. Apples and bananas will clog your coronary arteries. Brussels sprouts will clog your coronary arteries, although the blockage is not as severe if you cook them first. We learned that from a consultant we brought in to fix the lab equipment. Eventually, we discovered that pretty much everything you eat will clog your coronary arteries, with the exception of chocolate ice cream. Because you can wash that down with a little hot water. My advice to you, if you want to avoid heart disease, base your diet on chocolate ice cream with hot water. Now, would you all agree that my experiment there was based on solid scientific principles? Don't flatter me, of course they weren't. That was ridiculous, that was bad science. What I hope to convince everybody here tonight is that for 50 years we've been operating under this belief that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. What I hope to show you is that from the very beginning, that belief was based on bad science. I also hope to show you that the advice that grew out of that belief not only has not made us any healthier, it ultimately led to the rise in diabetes and this epidemic of type 2 diabetes and obesity that we see today. So I'm going to be saying that this whole thing was based on bad science. So to get started, I just want to talk briefly about good science versus bad science. And I know you had this in high school, but let's take a quick review. What makes a good scientist? A good scientist, first and foremost, tries to be objective. Now, when he's conducting research, he almost certainly has a theory in mind, but his ultimate goal is to find the truth. That means he's going to be open to alternate theories. He'll consider all the evidence, and this is hugely important, it's why it's in red. If he sees solid evidence that does not support his theory, he will conclude that his theory is probably wrong. Because in good science, a theory is not considered valid unless the evidence supporting it is consistent and repeatable. There was a famous science philosopher named Karl Popper who called this the black swan test. If your theory is that all swans are white, your obligation as a scientist is to look for black swans. If you don't find any, your theory might be valid, but as soon as you or anyone else starts spotting black swans, your theory is no longer valid. And it doesn't matter how many white swans you can point to, your theory is not valid because it is not consistent. That's how a good scientist thinks. Now, a bad scientist doesn't think this way. Bad scientists typically have big egos. They fall in love with their own theories. Consequently, when a bad scientist conducts research, his ultimate goal is to prove that he is right. That means he will ignore alternate theories, he'll ignore the contrary evidence, or find a way to explain it away In other words, if you show a bad scientist a black swan, he will explain how it is either not a swan or not black. And if he's a truly bad scientist, he'll commit the biggest sin of all, which is perform mathematical magic on his own data to produce the results he wants. Does anybody think that never happens? Good. Now let's talk about the kind of studies that our good and bad scientists might be conducting. In fields like health and medicine and nutrition, studies are going to fall into one of two categories: observational studies and clinical studies. Now, an observational study is by far the most common type, and it's exactly what it sounds like. We are simply observing people. We're not treating them. In other words, we're not giving them a drug. We're not putting them on any kind of a diet. We are just observing them and gathering data. Now, what we hope to find if we gather the data are traits, behaviors, and results that seem to occur together. If they do occur together, we will say they are statistically associated or correlated, or very often in media stories, you'll simply see that referred to as linked. Now, if two traits are linked, if they're associated, we should be able to plot the data on a chart and show, for instance, that smoking is associated with a higher rate of lung cancer, or taking estrogen is associated with a lower rate of heart disease, or going bald is associated with wanting to own a red convertible. Not quite as much research on that one. 90% of the time that you're reading the newspaper and you see a headline like this, egg intake is linked to diabetes risk, you're looking at the results of an observational study. Now, there's a huge problem with observational studies, which I'm going to demonstrate by giving you an example. If I were to do a 5-year observational study on the men of Williamson County, I could prove to you absolutely positively the size of a man's bald spot is correlated with the onset of heart disease. Now, if the bad scientists or the bad media reporters got a hold of that, that would lead to this, which 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 would lead to this. Now, does anybody here think male pattern baldness actually causes heart disease? No, but the two are associated. Why? Because as men get older, they are more likely to lose their hair, and they are more likely to develop heart disease. What we're looking at there is the variable that the investigators did not look for. That happens all the time, and it's called a confounding variable. Observational studies are full of confounding variables, and if the researchers aren't thinking about them and not looking for them, they won't spot them. If I asked you all right now, go out to the street and spend 5 minutes out there, count the number of Toyotas that drove by, you'd be able to come back and give me an accurate number, right? Then if I said, well, how many Buicks went by? You'd have no idea, because you weren't looking for them. That is the problem with observational studies. That is why the good scientists have a saying, correlation does not prove causation. When good scientists want something they're willing to consider proof, they conduct the other kind of study, a clinical study. Clinical studies are the gold standard. They're the only kind that really matter. Why? Because you can control your variables. In a clinical study, we will take two large groups of people and we'll make sure they're balanced for things like age and race and gender and their previous health history, socioeconomic status, everything we can think of, right? And that's obviously important, because if I wanted to test, say, the effect of a drug on heart disease, and I've got one group of people, it turns out they're full of smokers, and the other group isn't, we know the smokers are going to screw up the data. So we want to keep these groups as statistically balanced as possible, and then we change one variable. That one group may take a drug while this group takes a placebo. Neither group knows what they're taking, or one group will go on a diet, the other group won't, or they'll go on 2 different diets. And now, because we controlled every other variable except one, if these groups end up with a significantly different outcome, we know the difference is probably due to that one variable. Is that clear? Good enough. Now, I want to give you an example of why good scientists don't jump to conclusions based on observational studies. For decades, there's been an observational study going on called the Harvard Nurses Study. Thousands of women involved. And one of the associations they pulled out of that study some years ago was this. Middle-aged women who took estrogen had a 40% lower rate of heart disease. Now, based on this, the bad scientists and some bad doctors were ready to run out and start prescribing estrogen to every middle-aged woman in the country. The good scientists said, now wait a minute, correlation does not prove causation. We need to conduct a clinical study. So they did. Major clinical study, 16,000 women involved. It lasted for 5.5 years. Here was the result. Women who took estrogen ended up with a 30% higher rate of heart disease. They also had more strokes. There was another clinical study, same result. There was a clinical study with men and estrogen, same result. Estrogen turned out to be harmful. Now, how could this be? If estrogen's not reducing heart disease, why would a large clinical study, a large observational study show us that women who took estrogen had a lower rate of heart disease? Can anybody guess? There was a great big confounding variable called health consciousness. The women who were taking the estrogen were taking it because they believed it was good for them, and these were women who cared about their health. Health-conscious women are different. Health-conscious people are less likely to smoke, they're less likely to drink too much, less likely to consume sodas and candy and other forms of junk. They're more likely to exercise, to get enough sleep, to take their vitamins, and to go see their doctor if something is wrong. In other words, the estrogen was not making those nurses healthy, but the health-conscious nurses were far more likely to take estrogen. And their better health habits more than offset what turned out to be the negative effects of taking the estrogen. Now that's why I said there's a problem with observational studies, because in observational studies, this phenomenon happens all the time. Health-conscious people will naturally gravitate toward what they're told is good for them. They will tend to stay away from what they are told is bad for them. And in doing that, they can create statistical associations that have absolutely nothing to do with the actual effectiveness of the product. So that leads to the question, how much bad science is actually out there? It just so happened, as I was working on this speech, this article appeared in the Atlantic. Dr. John Ioannidis has spent his career challenging his peers by exposing their bad science. Dr. John Ioannidis is not only a Harvard MD, he's a mathematical genius, and he likes to go through studies and find the flaws. I want to give you some quotes from this article. It's very important. He and his team have shown again and again in many different ways that much of what biomedical researchers conclude in published studies, conclusions that doctors keep in mind when they prescribe blood pressure medication, or when they advise us to consume more fiber or less meat, is misleading, exaggerated, and often flat out wrong. He charges that as much as 90% of the published medical information that doctors rely on is flawed. When it came to cancer, heart disease, and other common ailments, there was plenty of published research, but much of it was remarkably unscientific, based largely on observations. There's that word again. 80% of non-randomized studies, those are observational studies, turn out to be wrong. Researchers were frequently manipulating their data analyses, chasing career-advancing findings rather than good science, and even using the peer review process to suppress opposing views. So, with all that in mind, let's take a quick look at heart disease in America, and we'll see some truly bad science in action. Now, believe it or not, 100 years ago, most doctors did not even learn about heart disease in medical school. Why? Because as far as they knew, hardly anybody died from it. They literally weren't taught about it. If you track the official statistics in America, this is what we get. Really low rate of heart disease here, and then around 1920 we start getting this rise, and by 1950 it's considered an epidemic. It is now the #1 cause of death in America. Now, to a certain degree, this rise statistically is exaggerated because the EKG wasn't even invented until 1920, so we probably had people die of heart disease that were never diagnosed. Also, penicillin had come along. So fewer people are dying from infections. Well, we're all going to die, right? So if you don't die from an infection, you're more likely to die of anything else, including heart disease. But even considering that, we clearly had this rising problem And what really set off alarm bells in the medical community is by World War II, they were seeing a lot more men in their 40s and 50s dying from heart disease. Now, I've been a comedian, I've also worked in the media, so I understand the difference between a national problem and a national crisis. A national problem means bad things are happening to you and me. A national crisis means a celebrity has been affected. And in 1953, a rather important celebrity had a heart attack, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now we do have a national crisis. We have this epidemic of heart disease, and nobody knows what to cause it. And then, as luck would have it, along came a scientist with the answer. This is Ansel Keys. He was a biochemist, and in the mid-1950s, he published a study in which he compared fat consumption with heart disease in a half-dozen countries. This is what he got. Well, there you have it. Look at that. The higher the fat consumption, the higher the rate of heart disease. Trend line is unmistakable. Case closed. Eating fat causes heart disease. Because of this study, Ansel Keys became known as the father of what we now call the lipid hypothesis. This is what we still believe today. Saturated fat raises cholesterol in your blood. That's the first half. The second half, the high cholesterol in your blood is what clogs your arteries and causes heart disease. Everybody's familiar with that, right? Now let's look at some of the bad science that brought it about. First off, was this an observational study or a clinical study?
Observational.
Thank you. Observational. So does that prove anything? No, of course not. This is the association that Keys found because it's the association that Ansel Keys was looking for. But within the same data that he used to create this, heart disease was also associated with sugar consumption. It was associated with owning a television, and it was associated with owning a car. Ansel Keys could have zeroed in on any one of those, especially sugar, but he chose saturated fat because he had already decided saturated fat was the problem. And to believe that, he had to ignore some contrary evidence. And BS here, by the way, stands for bad science. Some of the evidence he ignored. Large populations like the Eskimos and our own buffalo hunting tribes who lived on diets that consisted primarily of fatty meat. Yet these people virtually had no heart disease. In fact, the Indians didn't even start developing heart disease until they were forced onto reservations and they had to start living on sugar and starch. A couple decades before Ansel Keys, there was a doctor who traveled the world named Weston Price. He examined populations, their diets, the degree of health they had or did not have, and he came to exactly that conclusion. Most populations, you will not find any significant amount of heart disease, cancer, or diabetes until the point that they start consuming sugar and white flour. Keys also had to ignore this contrary evidence. We had this big rise in heart disease, right? Well, if animal fat is causing this big rise, Americans must have been consuming a lot more animal fat, right? So let's look at butter consumption during the same basic period. Seems to have been going down. Okay, maybe it wasn't the butter. How about lard? Look at that big drop in lard from 1940 to 1960, straight down. That is the same time heart disease was shooting up. In fact, during the period heart disease was going up, Americans were not consuming more animal fat. They were consuming more vegetable fat because chemical processing had come along and made vegetable fat a lot cheaper. There was also this bit of contrary evidence. If Dwight Eisenhower had heart disease and high cholesterol causes heart disease, Dwight Eisenhower must have had high cholesterol, right? I mean, I bet if somebody checked his medical records, we'd find out it was way up there around... That was his cholesterol when he had his first heart attack. Now, if high cholesterol causes heart disease, why would anybody with low cholesterol get heart disease? But they do. It happens all the time, which you'll see. Now, this is the real reason I think Ansel Keys is probably the ultimate bad scientist. Let's suppose you have fallen in love with your own theory, and if your theory is true, you should see an association like this. Now let's suppose you gather the data on diets and heart disease from not 6, but 22 countries. You plot the data, and it looks like that. What would you do? You would do exactly what Ansel Keys did. He just threw out the data he didn't like and published his results. He was so convinced his theory was correct, he simply forced the data to fit the theory. Now, his punishment for being a bad scientist was to end up on the cover of Time magazine as a national hero. He later ended up on the board of the American Heart Association, and at that point, after several years of disputing the lipid hypothesis, the American Heart Association adopted it and started telling us all we should cut back on saturated fat and cholesterol to avoid heart disease. Now, since this theory was getting traction, not surprisingly, there were several clinical studies to test the results. Clinical studies, the kind that matter, right? Let's look at a few results. In the 1950s, there was the prudent dietary trial. Our intervention group went on a low-fat diet, including mostly vegetable oils. Control group, of course, was on their normal diet. The result, why the low-fat diet group dropped their cholesterol by 30 points. Very good, but there was no difference in heart disease. In 1965, there was a dietary trial in Britain. The intervention group cut their animal fat intake to 3 ounces of meat, 1 egg, 2 ounces of skim milk per day. They also dropped their cholesterol, but there was no difference in heart disease. Also in Britain, in the same time, there was a secondary prevention trial. Now this time, the subjects were all men who had already had a heart attack, some of whom wore skirts, apparently. And the idea here was to see if by changing the diet, can we prevent a second heart attack. So they put one group on a diet where they switched their fat intake to polyunsaturated corn oil. Second group switched to olive oil. The third group, the control group, continued eating a diet high in animal fat. The results years later, corn oil group, 52% were still alive. Olive oil, 57% still alive. Okay, olive oil's looking good. The group that continued eating animal fat, 75% were still alive. 1969, there was the Minnesota coronary trial. This time, the diet group, low-fat diet, very little saturated fat, extra vegetables. They had slightly more heart attacks than the group that did not change their diet. And finally, the big daddy of them all, and I say that because this was run by our own National Institutes of Health, 12,000 men involved, some still wearing skirts apparently. It lasted for years. It cost $115 million. The intervention group went on a low-fat diet, avoided red meat, cut back on cholesterol. They were also counseled to quit smoking. The results, the people who quit smoking had a lower rate of heart disease. It's one of the studies that made it clear smoking can cause heart disease. But when they compared smokers to smokers and non-smokers to non-smokers between those two groups, the low-fat diet group, once again, had slightly more heart attacks. Now, I can quote you more, but you get the idea, right? Can we say there are black swans all over the place at this point? This diet, this hypothesis was failing over and over in clinical research. This guy's absolutely full of black swans. By now you're probably wondering, okay, what could have possibly kept such an unscientific, discredited, and possibly even harmful idea alive? In the 1970s, there was a special Senate committee. It was headed by George McGovern. Their mission was to deal with malnutrition. Not surprisingly for a government committee, they decided they should expand their mission and create dietary guidelines for the entire country. So they brought in the experts, they had hearings, they produced the guidelines. This is what they ended up giving us. They recommended that we reduce our consumption of fat, switch from saturated fat to vegetable oils, cut back on cholesterol to the equivalent of 1 egg per day, and eat more carbohydrates, especially carbohydrates from grains. Later, of course, that became the basis for the USDA food pyramid. USDA loved this report because it was telling people to eat more grains. Well, the USDA's mission is to sell grains. So if this is what the McGovern Committee recommended, it must have been what all the scientists told them, right? Of course not. There were several eminent scientists who testified to the McGovern Committee that there was no scientific basis for what they were recommending. A prominent British researcher named John Yudkin said, if anything in the diet is causing heart disease, it is sugar. Another researcher named Peter Klee pointed out that heart disease, cancer, and diabetes are what we call diseases of civilization, and said it is, quote, ludicrous to blame modern diseases on ancient foods. Saturated fat is an ancient food. He said if we were going to be looking at diet, we should once again be looking at the modern foods, such as sugar and white flour. The American Medical Association disagreed with the McGovern Committee, saying the evidence set forth in this report is not conclusive, and there's potential for harmful effects from a radical long-term dietary change. And finally, the head of the National Academy of Sciences said, "What right has the federal government to propose that the American people conduct a vast nutritional experiment with themselves as subjects on the strength of so very little evidence?" Evidence. There really wasn't much. But McGovern believed in the lipid hypothesis, largely because his own doctor had told him it was true. And this is how he handled dissent.
The committee's original report urged Americans to reduce their risk of heart attacks by reducing their intake of cholesterol, down to the equivalent of about 1 egg a day. But doctors took issue with that at the hearing, saying that 8 studies involving 5,000 patients failed to show hard medical evidence that diet has anything to do with heart attacks.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
So the heart-healthy benefits of a low-fat diet became national policy because senators don't have time to wait for all the evidence to come in. According to people who worked with the committee, their thinking went something like this. Well, maybe we can't prove yet that saturated fat causes heart disease, but we think it probably does. So, we go ahead and start recommending that now. Why, we might save a whole lot more lives than if we wait 10 or 15 years for proof to come in to confirm what we think we already know. And if it turns out we're wrong, what's the harm? Well, I think there was a great deal of harm down the road, as you'll see later, but there was an immediate harm, and that immediate harm was to science. Because if you are a researcher, your research grants are your paycheck. No research grant means you're not working, you're not employed. And at this point in history, the U.S. government now officially supports the lipid hypothesis. The American Heart Association officially supports the lipid hypothesis. Those two organizations between them control more than 90% of all the funding dollars for research into heart disease. So what happens now if you're a scientist, not a scientist, you happen not to agree with the lipid hypothesis? A researcher named Dr. George Mann, who called the lipid hypothesis the greatest scientific scam of this century, wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine at this time, "To be a dissenter is to be unfunded." Science writer Gary Taubes later wrote about this point, "Nutritionists knew if their research failed to support the government position on a particular subject, the funding would go instead to someone whose research did." And I want to give you an example of what he was talking about. During the making of my documentary, I interviewed this man on the phone, Dr. Kilmer McCulley, who back in the day was a researcher at Harvard, and around this time he wrote a paper saying something other than cholesterol had to be causing the rise in heart disease. Basically, he was saying that Harvard, which was getting a lot of its research from the federal government, was wrong, and that the federal government was wrong. To thank him for having scientific integrity, Harvard revoked his research grants, denied him tenure, and forced him to quit. And despite having a long pedigree from Harvard, it took him 2 more years to find another research job because, as he found out later, Harvard had blacklisted him. This is what happened to the scientists who disagreed. But if anything really drove it home to the rest of us, to the public, that we had to avoid saturated fat and heart disease to protect our hearts, it was this. Anybody my age or older, do you remember this cover? Remember that? The bad Harvard revoked his research grants, denied him tenure, and forced him to quit. And despite having a long pedigree from Harvard, it took him 2 more years to find another research job because, as he found out later, Harvard had blacklisted him. This is what happened to the scientists who disagreed. But if anything really drove it home to the rest of us, to the public, that we had to avoid saturated fat and heart disease to protect our hearts, it was this. Anybody my age or older, do you remember this cover? Remember that? The bad news, cholesterol, yes, it's true. Cholesterol is a killer, complete with bacon and eggs making an unhappy face. The title of the article inside was, "Cholesterol is proved deadly and our diet may never be the same." Our diet. Obviously, Time magazine must have been reporting on the results of a major new diet study, right? Of course not. Time magazine reached this conclusion because in 1984, for the first time, a cholesterol-lowering drug was shown to slightly reduce heart disease in men with genetically high cholesterol. And I say slightly reduced because of this. I looked up the original numbers. This was a study involving 3,000 men, half of whom were put on a new cholesterol-lowering drug called cholestyramine, the others, of course, on a placebo. After 10 years, here are the results. Men on the drug in that group, 30 heart attack deaths, 68 total deaths. The placebo group, 38 heart attack deaths, 71 total deaths. Difference of 8 among 3,000 men. If you run the math, which I did, it means the difference in the heart attack death rate between these two groups was slightly less than 0.5%. In other words, if I took 200 men with genetically high cholesterol and I gave this drug for 10 years, this drug would have prevented one heart disease death. Now, if you want to see a really amazing bad science leap in logic based on this result, here is what the lead investigator told Time magazine. This study strongly indicates that the more you lower cholesterol and fat in your diet, the more you reduce your risk of heart disease. Do we see a problem with this? Drug study somehow becomes diet? What happened was, at this point, the anti-fat hysterics were so desperate to save the lipid hypothesis, I kid you not, they invented a new form of analysis, and they called it teleoanalysis. And here's how it works. We cannot prove, despite years of trying, that A causes C. But if we can prove that A is linked to B, and B is linked to C, we may still conclude that A causes C. Does that seem logical? Because if it does, I want to try it in some other situations here. Excess water, we know, will produce frequent urination. Frequent urination is linked to diabetes. Therefore, excess water will give you diabetes. Or I'll give you a more relevant example. Because what Time magazine either didn't know or didn't report was that the first generation of cholesterol-lowering drugs were huge flops. In the 1970s, there was a clinical trial of a drug called clofhidrate, which did in fact lower cholesterol dramatically, but they had to stop that trial halfway through because the men taking it had a 47% higher death rate. So let's apply some teleoanalysis, shall we? Low-fat diets can lower cholesterol. In a clinical trial, lower cholesterol led to a higher death rate. Therefore, I say low-fat diets will kill you. My teleoanalysis is every bit as valid as theirs. But this is what they concluded. This is what we got from Time magazine. This is the point where everybody just knew saturated fat was going to kill you. This is when Snackwells came out, and everybody was running out and filling up on the low-fat cookies and the fat-free cakes and the fat-free ice cream and the fat-free potato chips and pretzels. This is when schools decided they had to take whole milk off the menu. Everybody just knew this was bad. Remember what we saw earlier with the estrogen thing? People who have good health habits gravitate towards what they're told is good for them. They stay away from what they think is bad for them. And in doing that, they can create false associations, right? In fact, if I could convince the media to cooperate with me and produce headlines like this, I can promise you within 10 years there would be an association between eating celery and some disease or another. Why? Because the health-conscious people would be avoiding it. So what effect do you think that had? That is why in some studies there's been an association between saturated fat and heart disease. But we need to look at where saturated fat in the American diet comes from. According to the USDA, here are your top 5 sources. Do you see any potential confounding variables there? Pizza, grain-based desserts, cookies, Little Debbie snap cakes, dairy desserts, are these the foods health-conscious people are going to eat a lot of? Of course not. Also, let's suppose that the people who told the McGovern Committee that the real problem with heart disease was sugar and white flour happen to be right. Wouldn't you say it's possible that in America, given this, the people who eat a lot of saturated fat are the same people who eat a lot of sugar and white flour? I think it's obvious that they do. The point is, if saturated fat were the problem, if it caused heart disease, we would see that result, again, consistently, repeatedly, around the world, but we don't. I'm sure you've all heard of the French paradox, right? Compared to Americans, the French consume twice as much saturated fat, including 4 times as much butter, 3 times as much pork, 60% more cheese. Their rate of heart disease is barely 1/3 of ours. And it has been fun watching the bad scientists try to just explain this black swan away with excuses like, it's because they drink so much red wine. Well, A little red wine may in fact be beneficial, but let's think this one through. The French are eating a diet that is supposed to induce heart disease. They smoke more than Americans do. Anybody who's been there knows that. We know smoking causes heart disease, and yet somehow red wine magically offsets this entire heart disease-inducing lifestyle. If that's what's happening, next time you go to your doctor, just say, "Shut up about my diet and write me a prescription for red wine." Back, make it a gallon, I'm having a barbecue this weekend. The other excuse they've come up with, kid you not, is the French actually do have a lot of heart disease. French doctors are just really bad at diagnosing it. I guess because they drink too much red wine. That's all I can figure. Well, unfortunately for the people spouting this nonsense, there is also a Swiss paradox. The Swiss have the second highest intake of saturated fat in the Western world. They also have the second lowest rate of heart disease. There is a Spanish paradox. In the last 30 years, saturated fat intake in Spain has gone up, while heart disease has continued going down. So I hope you are convinced by this point, part one of the lipid hypothesis is not true, certainly not consistent. Saturated fat is not causing heart disease. But now, that second part, we all know that's true, right? Everybody knows high cholesterol causes heart disease because all the experts say so. There is so much evidence that that is not true, I could spend an hour and a half just going through that, so I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples. Some years ago, the World Health Organization conducted a worldwide study of average cholesterol levels and rates of heart disease in many, many countries around the world. Now, if we were to take that data and plot it, if high cholesterol does cause heart disease, if we took the World Health Organization data, we should see this, right? Higher cholesterol equals higher heart disease. Well, I downloaded the World Health Organization data, I plugged it into Excel, I plotted it, and this is what it looks like. Does anybody there see a correlation? See this guy out here? That's Luxembourg. Average cholesterol in Luxembourg, 232, one of the lower rates of heart disease in the world. This out here is Venezuela, average cholesterol, 177, 45 points lower than in Luxembourg. Their rate of heart disease is nearly 5 times higher. This is Russia, average cholesterol, 189, wouldn't that make your doctor proud? Screamingly high rate of heart disease, second highest rate of heart disease in the world. And down here's the supposed magic number, 200. We have everything from very low rates of heart disease to the highest rate of heart disease in the world. Now, how anybody can look at that and still believe that high cholesterol causes heart disease is beyond me, and yet they do. And it's amazing the mental hoops they can jump through to hang on to that belief. I'm going to give you an example here. You might remember this because this was in the newspaper maybe a year and a half ago. Most heart attack patients' cholesterol levels did not indicate heart attack risk. What they meant by that was, it turns out that people with LDL cholesterol below 130, that's down there in the range the American Heart Association tells you should be at, experience 72.1% of all heart attacks. That immediately got me wondering, well, okay, what percent of the population are we talking about there? So I went looking for the data. I found it on the American Heart Association's website. It turns out that in America, people with LDL cholesterol below 130 make up 67% of the population, but as we just saw, they are experiencing 72.1% of the heart attacks, which means people here with the low cholesterol are having a slightly higher rate of heart disease than these people with the higher cholesterol. Now, let's suppose you are a researcher on this study. You already know the French and the Swiss have high cholesterol but low heart disease. You know the Russians and the Venezuelans have low cholesterol, screamingly high rates of heart disease. You've now just conducted a study and found out that in America, people with low cholesterol have a slightly higher rate of heart disease than people with high cholesterol. What would you conclude from that? A, maybe high cholesterol does not cause heart disease. Or B, we need to set the cholesterol targets even lower. Well, that is, of course, the spin they put on it. Cholesterol must still be too high. I saw that, and it just sent me into this head-slapping incident thinking, okay, let me follow their thinking here. If these people with low cholesterol could push it even lower, then they'd have a lower rate of heart disease like these people who have higher cholesterol. And then if they push their cholesterol down even lower, they would finally have a really low rate of heart disease, like the French and the Swiss, who have high cholesterol. Does any of this make sense to anybody? Do you see anything scientific there? No, I think it's obvious that what this data tells us is that the lipid hypothesis is wrong. And what the recent research is showing is that heart disease does not begin because your cholesterol goes up. Heart disease begins when your coronary arteries become damaged or inflamed. When that happens, LDL cholesterol will show up to try to repair the damage. Why? Because that is exactly what LDL cholesterol is supposed to do. It is an important part of your body's repair system. Unfortunately, LDL cholesterol comes in different sized packages. It can be large and fluffy, or it can be small and dense. Large, fluffy cholesterol is not harmless. In fact, it appears to have antiviral and anti-inflammatory properties. Small, dense cholesterol can be a problem, because if small, dense cholesterol shows up to repair your arteries, it can slip into the wall of the artery and get stuck there. And when that happens, it'll become rancid, it will oxidize, it will start to attract white blood cells, which will also get stuck back there. That is how you start getting a plaque to build up, and that is how you end up with heart disease. It has nothing to do with how much cholesterol is in your body. It has to do with what kind of cholesterol you're making. And that's why Dwight Eisenhower, with cholesterol of 165, could develop heart disease. So let's look at what might be driving heart disease. We said it starts with inflammation. What causes inflammation? Three biggest sources: smoking, elevated blood sugar, emotional stress. Sugar and refined carbohydrates will elevate your blood sugar. Dietary fat does not elevate your blood sugar. We know that heart disease may continue if small, dense LDL shows up to repair the damage. So what kind of food in our diet would produce small, dense LDL? Does anybody at this point want to raise their hand and say bacon and eggs? No? Sugar and refined carbohydrates are the foods that cause your body to produce small, dense LDL. The people who told the McGovern committee it was sugar and white flour probably had it right all along. Now, fortunately, after 40 years of blaming saturated fat, we're starting to see more. Sugar and refined carbohydrates are the foods that cause your body to produce small, dense LDL. The people who told the McGovern committee it was sugar and white flour probably had it right all along. Now, fortunately, after 40 years of blaming saturated fat, we're starting to see more research. We're starting to see that people are letting go of that idea. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. This is from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Among postmenopausal women, a higher saturated fat intake was associated with less progression of heart disease, whereas carbohydrate intake was associated with a greater progression of heart disease. Also from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, as it turns out, upon further review, saturated fat is not independently associated with cardiovascular disease. Quote, dietary efforts to reduce increasing burden of cardiovascular risk should primarily emphasize the limitation of refined carbohydrates. Now, those are observational studies. We don't want to make too much of them, so I'll show you a couple of clinical studies. This was in the Annals of Internal Medicine. The clinical study, the kind that mattered, one group was on a low-fat, low-calorie diet. The other group was on a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet. The result, people on the high-fat diet showed greater reductions in blood pressure, triglycerides, small dense LDL, while raising their HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, by 23%. In other words, the diet that was supposed to kill us turned out to be producing the greatest improvements in cardiovascular markers. There was another study, clinical study, at Stanford. This time there were three groups. One group was on the Atkins diet, one was on the American Heart Association diet, third group was on the Dean Ornish very low-fat diet. And once again, people on the Atkins diet not only lost more weight, they showed the greatest improvements in cardiovascular markers. People on the Ornish diet, the low-fat diet, showed the least improvement. Now what was interesting about this one is that this guy here, the lead investigator, the one that looks sort of John Denverish, he's a longtime vegetarian who admitted it pained him to report these results. But he's a good scientist, so he did. Now, given all this recent research, I think it's obvious the lipid hypothesis was a big fat fiasco, partly because we've spent 40 years aiming at the wrong target. But to me, the real big fiasco is what it did to the composition of our diets. If we compare the American diet back in the days of the McGovern Committee to today, this is what we get. It's the proportion of where we are getting our calories. You can see, compared to 1977, we are consuming less protein, significantly less fat, and quite a bit more carbohydrate. And that is why I believe we've seen such a rise in obesity and diabetes. Now, I'm not going to show you the figures on obesity because you've seen them on the news a gazillion times, and they always show the fat people walking by. So let's just talk about what might be causing this. The prevailing theory for why people have been getting heavier is what I call the fat, lazy slob theory. Which is, well, gosh darn it, people just eat too much and they don't exercise enough, so they're getting fat. In other words, they think this was all about a change in character. For 200 years, apparently, Americans had the good discipline to eat just enough and make sure they got enough exercise, and so we stayed lean, and now, all in one generation, mind you, 2/3 of Americans decided, what the heck, I'll just become a fat, lazy slob. So our grandparents had character, but we don't. That sound about right? See, I don't believe in the fat, lazy slob theory because I don't think this is about character. I think this is clearly about a change in biochemistry. Because to me, saying some people are obese because they eat too much is about as illuminating as saying, well, some people are alcoholics because they drink too much. That not only doesn't provide an answer, it's not even asking the right question, which is, why are they drinking too much? Why do some people crave alcohol in a way that normal people don't? Well, same thing here. If we're going to understand why people have been getting heavier, then we need to understand why they're craving more food. And we need to understand it at the biochemical level. So let's take a quick look at what causes us to gain weight. Now, for generations, we've all been told that gaining and losing weight works just like a bank account. It's all about calories in versus calories out. If you eat too much, you make deposits in your fat cells, and then they just sit there like bad pennies until you finally develop some discipline, make a withdrawal, which you must do by eating less or exercising more. And 3,500 calories equals 1 pound of fat. So just cut 500 calories a day out of your diet, and you'll lose 1 pound a week. Has everybody heard that one? Anybody tried to do it and found out it doesn't seem to work so well? That's the problem with this theory. It doesn't work in real life. It doesn't even work in clinical research. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the Women's Health Initiative, thousands of women cut their calorie intake by an average of 360 calories, mostly by going on lower fat diets. They were on that for 8 years. Average weight loss, 2 pounds. Some of the women lost weight and ended up with bigger bellies, by the way. There was, on the other side of the calorie equation, there was a man named James Levine who conducted overfeeding studies. He took naturally lean prisoners, these guys with the veiny arms and legs and ripped abs, and he had them eat thousands of extra calories per day for several months. None of them gained close to what the calories in, calories out equation predicted they should gain. In fact, one prisoner consumed 10,000 calories for 200 days, and he lost 9 pounds. I've done that gained 9 pounds, which I can do in a bad weekend, by the way. Same thing has happened in animal research. This was a recent study. Researchers took obese mice. They cut their calorie intake by 5% for 4 weeks. The result, they gained adipose tissue and lost lean muscle mass. In other words, dieting made them fatter. Now, clearly there's something a lot more complex going on with weight loss than just counting the calories in and the calories out. And as it turned out, back in the 1930s, German and Austrian researchers did, in fact, figure it out. Unfortunately, World War II came along. Their work was lost. Hadn't been seen for decades. But this is what they figured out. Your body fat is actually a crucial part of your metabolism. And the amount of body fat you're going to carry around is largely determined by hormones. Now, there are a lot of hormones involved here, but the grand poobah, the big mover, is insulin. If you know diabetics, you know they take insulin to keep their blood sugar down. Why? Because high blood sugar is toxic, right? High blood sugar will kill you. If they don't control their blood sugar, they can go blind, they can lose their kidneys, they can end up having their limbs amputated. At the same time, your brain needs blood sugar, and low blood sugar is dangerous because low blood sugar can send you into a coma, and you can even die. So, at any given moment, this is crucially important, your metabolism's #1 goal is to keep your blood sugar in a very narrow range. That's what insulin helps to do, and when it's working, when your metabolism is functioning, this is actually an engineering marvel. So let's take a look at how this works inside the body. For purposes of illustration, these are our fat cells with little fat globules in them. This is our bloodstream with both fat and sugar in it. And down here we have some really handsome muscles and organs, okay? Now, the first thing we need to understand about how this metabolism works is that the vast majority of your body can burn either sugar or fat for fuel. In fact, when you wake up in the morning, maybe it's been 12 hours since you ate, you might be getting as much as 85% of your body's energy at that point from fat. So, you eat a meal and your blood sugar goes up. You now have both sugar and fat in your bloodstream. Well, high blood sugar is toxic. So your metabolism's goal at this point is to bring your blood sugar down, which means it wants you to switch from burning primarily fat to burning primarily sugar for a while. That's what insulin does. So out comes insulin, these little eyes. Insulin pushes the sugar into your cells, so you'll burn off the sugar first, and at the same time, insulin pushes fat into your fat cells and holds it there. It holds it there to make sure you will burn the sugar first. And if your sugar is still too high, your body will send blood sugar off to your liver, which will convert it to fat and store it. So, a little while later, because you've been burning sugar, your blood sugar starts to drop. Well, if your blood sugar goes too low, once again, that's bad for your brain. Your brain needs some blood sugar. At this point, your metabolism's goal is to keep your blood sugar level by slowly switching you back to burning fat. So, for that to happen, the insulin goes down. Since the insulin level is down, the fat is no longer locked in your fat cells. It will slip back into your bloodstream, and it will start feeding your muscles and organs again. So as you can see, your fat cells are not a garbage dump. They're not something that only comes into the equation when you overeat. They're not something Mother Nature put on you so you'd be afraid to wear a bathing suit in public. Fat cells are an important part of your metabolism. If you all are hybrid cars, your fat cells are the rechargeable battery in the system. And to keep your blood sugar level, your body needs to be able to alternate between storing and retrieving fat all day long. Keep that blood sugar level by altering the mix. Is that clear? Okay. Brilliant system, isn't it? Now let's see how we can take that system and screw it up. First thing we need to understand is that carbohydrates are just sugar molecules strung together. When you consume carbohydrates, your digestive system will chop them up and turn them into blood sugar. Now, how many of you have heard of the glycemic index? Show of hands? Pretty much everybody? Good. Then, as you know, the glycemic index is a measurement of how quickly your body will turn various foods into sugar. The foods we ate during most of our evolution nearly all had a low glycemic index, somewhere between 20 and 40, which means for most of our evolution, we were never jacking our blood sugar up. So now let's look at the foods we eat today. Table sugar has a glycemic index of 64. Coca-Cola has a glycemic index of 63, pretty much like just drinking sugar. Well, we wouldn't want to put those in our bodies. Maybe we should stick with those wholesome foods the food pyramid would recommend, such as Raisin Bran, or shredded wheat, or whole wheat bread. How many of you didn't know this? Well, according to the FDA, because of this label they make all the food manufacturers use, you not only should be eating those, you should be eating somewhere between 300 and 400 grams per day of foods like that. Why? Because the McGovern Commission didn't want you to get your energy from fat because fat would kill you. Now, once again, what does this system do? Provides you with fuel while keeping your blood sugar level. What does level blood sugar mean? If you are not a diabetic, how much glucose do you think is in your entire bloodstream right now? Does anybody know? Can I get votes for 1 cup? If you're not a diabetic and you have normal blood sugar, the amount of glucose in your bloodstream right now is about 1 teaspoon. 300 carbohydrates per day is metabolized into 1.5 cups of sugar. 400 carbohydrates, which is actually the average in America these days, metabolizes into 2 cups of sugar. If you are getting 300 to 400 carbohydrates per day from high glycemic foods like these, you are flooding your bloodstream with sugar, which means your body is going to produce a lot of insulin to bring it down because it has to, because high blood sugar is toxic. Now, remember when you were a kid and you could eat as much junk as you wanted? You never gained any weight, never got fat. That's because when you were a kid, you still had a functioning metabolism, a resilient metabolism. That means you could flood your bloodstream with sugar, flood your bloodstream with sugar, and then your body would pump out a little squirt of insulin. It would knock your blood sugar down, and then the insulin level would drop, which means your body would go right back to burning fat the way it was designed to do, so you didn't gain weight. And for the naturally lean prisoners, naturally lean adults, those people who can eat all they want and never gain weight, that is the way it still works. Now, the problem for the rest of us is that if we keep forcing our bodies to produce extra insulin, over time our muscles and organs can become resistant to our own insulin. So it's kind of like if you keep listening to headbang and rock and roll, you can start to lose your hearing, and then if I want to communicate with you, I have to shout. Well, your body's way of shouting is to start producing more insulin to keep your blood sugar under control. It has to. High blood sugar is toxic. The problem is that extra insulin is doing its job. It's keeping your blood sugar down, but at the same time, the extra insulin is also shouting at your body to store fat, because insulin is a fat-storing hormone, and it doesn't care if you're getting fatter. It only cares that your blood sugar is not going up to toxic levels. So now a couple of things are going to happen here. The more that you become insulin resistant, the higher your level of insulin goes, the harder it's going to be for you to retrieve your body fat for fuel, which means that crucial part of your metabolism isn't working anymore. So two things are going to happen. One, obviously you're going to be getting fatter because fat's going into the fat cells and it's not coming out very quickly. But the other thing that's going to happen, these guys, the muscles and organs, are going to start shouting at you to eat more. Why? Because they're starving. Because at the point in this whole cycle where you are supposed to be switching back to burning fat, you can't release the fat quickly enough to keep them fed. So you have to eat more. In other words, despite everything you've been told, you're not getting fatter because you're eating more. You're eating more because you're getting fatter. You're eating more because you have to eat more to keep these guys fed. You're eating more because the rechargeable part of the system is broken. It's taken the energy in and it's not letting it go. Now, if you understand this, do you understand why I think the fat, lazy, slob theory is ridiculous? We see fat people eating a lot. We make these moral judgments. Look at those fat people eating too much. From a biochemical standpoint, they're not eating too much. They're eating what they need to eat. They're eating what they need to keep these guys from starving because too much of their fuel has gone up here and gotten locked in. By the same token, have any of us ever looked in the mirror and said, I'm a lazy slob because I weigh too much? We're all friends, we can admit it. I certainly have. Well, what if I told you from a biochemical standpoint, you're as fat as you need to be? You are actually as fat as you need to be. I'll explain what I mean. What is the point of this system again? Keep your blood sugar level. How? By alternately storing and retrieving fat. If the fat retrieval part of the system breaks down, it's not working, your body's going to fix it. Do you know how it's going to fix it? By making your fat cells bigger. Because bigger fat cells can release more fat. You will keep on getting fatter until you are fat enough to overcome your own insulin resistance. Until you are fat enough for your body to be able to once again retrieve enough fat out of those fat cells at the point in the cycle where you're supposed to be switching back to burning fat. Insulin, the bigger fat cells overcome the insulin resistance, and finally that part of the system works again. You don't like it, but your body's happy because it's keeping your blood sugar level again. Does that make sense? So, as I said before, this is not about character. This is about biochemistry. You've heard that 98% of all diets fail? That's why they fail. They fail because if you are insulin resistant, your body needs for you to be fat. If you try to shrink those fat tissues without solving this excess insulin problem first, all you're going to do is make these guys hungry, and then they're going to scream at you to eat more food. And then if you keep ignoring them, your body's going to decide to respond to that by conserving fuel, by slowing down your metabolism, which it can do. Your body can slow your metabolism dramatically. So So your metabolism goes down. Now you stop losing weight. You get frustrated. You go off the diet. The weight snaps back, which is what usually happens. Why? Because if you're insulin resistant, your body needs for you to be fat. I want to give you one example of how powerful insulin is. In laboratory studies, they have taken fat mice and they've made them fatter by injecting them with insulin and then allowing them to eat as much as they wanted, because insulin ramps up their appetite. And then they kept injecting them with insulin, but they cut their food supply off completely. Those mice starved to death without burning up their body fat. The signal from insulin to keep storing fat was so powerful that they digested their muscles and organs instead. Now, because of all the bad scientists and the anti-fat hysterics, if you're overweight, you're probably going to be told to go on a low-fat, low-cholesterol, low-calorie diet, which, if you are not insulin resistant, might work. But if you are insulin resistant, and that's a high-carbohydrate diet, because most low-fat diets are, all you're doing with yourself is creating sort of a modified version of the situation that will allow a fat mouse to starve to death without burning up its own body fat. And then when this diet fails, which it probably will, the people who recommended it will blame the dieters for being fat, lazy slobs. Right. And if those mice had more discipline, they would have burned up their own fat instead of starving to death, right? Does that make any sense? Of course not. We also know that insulin resistance can eventually lead to diabetes. I mean, you all understand that, right? If you keep having to crank out more and more insulin, eventually the pancreas, the beta cells in your pancreas are going to get overworked trying to produce all that insulin. They'll start to die out. Now you cannot produce enough insulin to keep your blood sugar down, and your blood sugar will go up. Now you're diabetic. Now that used to be called adult onset diabetes, because it pretty much only happened in adults. In the last decade or so, we've now called it type 2 diabetes, because it's happening to teenagers, it's happening to 10-year-olds, it's happening in kids. These are kids who are going to be screwed up for life. In the adult population, diabetes has just gone berserk. It's roughly doubled in the last 10 years. Among our senior citizens, 25% have type 2 diabetes now. What's amazing is that the bad scientists still insist that dietary fat did all this, made us obese and turned us into diabetics. Now, look at that composition of the diet again. Can that possibly be true? Back in the 1970s, when we were getting a lot more of the share of our diet from fat, where was all the obesity and where was all the type 2 diabetes then? That makes no sense. And if you really want to see some bad logic, look at this collection of statements by the American Diabetes Association. This comes from their own guidelines. Your digestive system turns carbohydrates into sugar quickly and easily. Carbohydrate is the food that most influences blood glucose levels. The more carbs you eat, the higher your blood glucose level goes. The higher your glucose, the more insulin you need to move the sugar into your cells, another thing, everything we've covered so far. The food pyramid is the easiest way to remember the healthiest foods to eat. At the bottom of the food pyramid are bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. These foods contain mostly carbohydrates. You need 6 to 8 servings of these foods per day. I've been saying all along that our dietary guidelines are based on bad science. I mean, I think I can rest my case there. When I finished working on my documentary, and I saw where the dietary guidelines came from, I couldn't help but wonder, what if the bad science hadn't happened? What if Ansel Keys hadn't done this, and he just kept looking at the data until he found the connection with sugar? What if, when low-fat diets failed over and over in clinical trials to reduce heart disease, the investigators had finally just admitted they were barking up the wrong tree? What if the McGovern committee decided, by gosh, senators do have time to wait for the evidence to come in? And what if Time magazine had given us this? I think if any of that had happened, that wouldn't have happened. This wouldn't have happened. This wouldn't have happened. That's why I say this was a big fat fiasco. Thank you very much.